I'm really excited and proud. It's the first time in history of the OPC Foundation, I believe, as far as I can remember, that we have a representative from North America's FBI. And I'm asking here, Joel, Max, if you can enable your camera, if you are online, if you are live, and here he is. Joel, it's a pleasure for me to have you online. I have to say again, and for the North America audience, we have to explain a little bit. You have been already in the morning session in Europe, which was a 3 a.m. presentation for you. Everybody who is internationally traveling, who is involved in web conferences, you know you can run a little bit later in the evening. That's why we work international. You can stay up in the morning a little bit earlier, okay. But doing a passion talk at 3 a.m. in the morning is honestly killing your day. And I like to, on the one hand, apologize for that, but on the other hand, say thank you very much that you did this job in the morning. Hopefully you could rest a little bit, and we are happy to hear now the second time from you presentations. For the audience, I like to address again to the audience. Number one, please put your questions into the Q&A window. Till now, there are not that many, honestly, so make use of that situation. And second, Joel is doing a verbal presentation. You do not see any slides, so please listen very carefully and in depth to his presentation. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me back. I have a little one at home, so I'm not a stranger to missing out on some sleep. It was a lot of fun doing this once a few hours ago and doing it again now with the folks who are on the call. So today I'm going to talk through some of the FBI's perspective on threats to operational technology networks, some of the trends that we are seeing through our engagements with victim companies, but also a lot of our proactive public-private partnerships and what we're learning from those. And then go through 5 new recommendations from the FBI on OT security, which will be forthcoming in a more organized written document that folks in industry can digest. But today you'll get the kind of the sneak preview and some of our initial thoughts on these. So to set the stage for this, as you know, as Stefan said, we're not necessarily the traditional attendee for maybe an OPC Foundation event, but I think we recognize the importance of the foundation and its members in setting the standards for nearly every critical infrastructure industry and application that there is. Something northwards of 52 million applications, so it touches nearly everything. And in my business of security and law enforcement intelligence, we're constantly seeing these technologies targeted by different actors. So OPC and its members play an integral role in understanding those technologies and the threats. So thank you for having me today. I think in this audience, some people may be more familiar with the FBI here in the United States, but more broadly, I like to note that we have presence in roughly 70 countries worldwide. We work closely with law enforcement intelligence around the world. So in the case of the FBI's mission, it's not just protecting critical infrastructure here in the United States, but protecting critical infrastructure around the world. And many of your companies, if not all of your companies, have business around the world. So I think hopefully this will resonate with you. I don't think much of what you're here today will be necessarily new or innovative, but that's really kind of what my key takeaway for folks today is that we're recommending kind of a return to the basics, for lack of a better way of putting it, and we are recommending a few things based on that. So these recommendations stem from a number of trends that I want to go over. And the first trend that we've seen over the last few months or last year or so through our engagements with industry, first and foremost, the biggest one is that when we engage with companies, whether that's post-intrusion or pre or post-intrusion, we're noticing that there's sometimes either a lack of visibility into kind of the layer 0, 1, 2, and 3, or just a complete inability to monitor those devices at that level. And so that lack of visibility is challenging from an asset owner operator perspective, because you don't necessarily know what's going on in your environment. And then if you have an incident, that makes it difficult for the FBI and its partners, or if you're in another country, for those entities to do attribution, to figure out who may have been behind a certain malicious action on your network. And that's challenging. I think most of the companies that we work with have had those challenges, even ones that have monitoring, trying to figure out a comprehensive way to aggregate logs and all the different types of data that you're collecting from your devices, putting it in a way that makes sense and that your analysts and the folks on your teams can make sense of. That's difficult. And so that's kind of the first theme that we have encountered, that lack of visibility into what's going on inside the OT network. The second kind of theme that has been seen to be true across the spectrum, whether it's nation state actors, cyber criminals, or others that are targeting OT networks, there's an increase in the amount of remote connections. So actors are taking advantage of a lot of not necessarily new connections to OT environments, but certainly since the pandemic, a lot of companies have moved to remote technologies to enable their workforce to be able to monitor and control facilities from a distance, or in some cases it's just a business. It's a business necessity to save on cost, and so that really has opened up, I think, the attack surface for adversaries that are looking to find new and novel ways into operational environments. You know, some of the traditional ways of segmenting networks and restricting that type of remote access have become lax in some areas, either out of a necessity in some cases, or just the fact that it may be a bit easier. And so that really opens up the attack surface and makes it difficult. And then if you kind of couple that with the lack of monitoring, that's the real-time monitoring that's going on, it's difficult to understand exactly who may be targeting your network, who may be inside those networks and seeking to have an effect. And then the third major theme is really kind of ties up the first two, and that's a lack of resources and capacity to address some of these issues in many cases where, not many of the companies we've engaged with across critical infrastructure, whether it's in energy or water, transportation, manufacturing, healthcare, you name it, many of these entities don't have really robust budgets for cybersecurity. I don't think it's for lack of acknowledging the problem and knowing that there's a lot of threats out there, but really when it comes down to it, every business has to prioritize the business and trying to balance business interests with security interests. And that's one of the things that we at the Bureau have been stressing, is that national security is business security as well. So no matter what country you're in, protecting that proprietary technology, protecting the essential service that you're providing to your consumers or your citizens, that's just as much a part of the business as anything else. But that's difficult, right? Resources don't come overnight. And so in many cases, we talk to companies who tell us that they would love to implement the latest and greatest recommendations that industry or government are presenting to them, but they just have to make choices about which ones they can and cannot implement. And so really those kind of themes that I mentioned are what led us to these recommendations. I'm not even going to call them necessarily new recommendations, because I don't think there's anything in here that's new, but I think that they're along the lines of a lot of the basics, and hopefully things that are able to be implemented by companies of every size, from the smallest company up to the largest Fortune 500. And so with that, launch into these recommendations. The first recommendation that we're presenting today is regards to end-to-end encryption. So we recommend that OT systems use end-to-end encryption for communication with control devices and with servers, independent of system architecture configuration. And within that, we recommend that the encryption algorithm should be strong, such as elliptical curve cryptography or RSA for asymmetric applications, and then AES 256 or greater for symmetric applications. So those are, when in terms of encryption, we see a lot of actors that are monitoring networks, and they're taking data that's transiting from device to device or device to server, vice versa, and that's helping adversaries understand your networks, the type of processes that you have in place. And so at least having that data encrypted can make a big difference in frustrating some of the intentions and some of the capabilities that these adversaries are developing. The second is in regards to certificate authorities and application identities. And so within this recommendation is that certificate authorities should be maintained internal to an organization and should be structured with appropriate levels of control, subject to the principle of least privilege. So in this case, we're really recommending that organizations take a look at how you're doing your certificate authorities, and that those certificate authorities are subject to the principle of least privilege. And you'll hear me talk about that in a second, that really when we look at access, a lot of it is user and role-based access controls. So that way you don't have a broad admin account that has access to absolutely everything, or you have maybe an engineering workstation that has more privileges than it needs. And so really restricting access based on the person. And within this recommendation, we recommend that organized certificate authorities enable use of unique application identifiers, and approval listing of all usable applications. And this level of authentication facilitates finely detailed access control to devices. So again, really recommending that when you look at who's having access to unique individual devices, that those accesses are done on a case-by-case basis and are really finely tuned to the personnel that you have working at your facilities. So if you have, for example, several manufacturing facilities, you may not necessarily need your technicians to have access to all of those facilities. You might just want to restrict access by facility, and in some cases, you may even want to restrict it more finely by process or by a specific OT network within that facility. So again, looking at those certificate authorities and application identities. The third is user authentication. This is absolutely critical. We recommend that users with any level of access to modify or request information from OT systems should be authenticated with individual access tokens with a limited duration of validity. And I want to pause here because the limited duration of validity is important, because often what we've observed through some of our engagements is that adversaries, once they have access tokens, in some cases we've seen organizations that those tokens are good for an extended period of time, and so it allows an adversary with legitimate access token to maintain that access over a long period of time. So cycling those and putting a limited duration on those tokens is helpful. It makes them work a little bit harder. And within this, each role, even for the same user, should be such as an operator or administrator, should hold specific permissions within the network. If implemented with application identification, the two identities combine to establish permissions. And this level of control ultimately limit the impact of unauthorized user gaining access to the system. So again, just kind of raising the bar a little bit higher. It doesn't prevent all the issues that we see at malicious actors employing, but it really makes it difficult if you're an actor trying to get unauthorized access to a system, if they have to grapple with both of those controls that are in place. And then further drilling down on this user authentication piece, all users with access to OT systems should have roles assigned to their profile, such as operator, administrator, or technician. So again, going by roles, not doing blanket access for users. This role system in which a single user may have multiple roles, for example, you may have an administrator who's also holds an operator role. This will enables the mapping of specific permissions to each assigned role. So mapping permissions to roles, and then those roles to specific access within your OT environment. And the combination of this unique application permissions and user role permission create trust lists. They enable that more detailed control over specific applications and the ability to be used for only authorized purposes. Again, making it very tailored for your environment and for the needs of whatever environment you're trying to control. The fourth recommendation is related to audit and event logging, and I think this is incredibly relevant. I think you'll find all of these relevant to OPC UA and the different standards, but this one especially, reading back on kind of the history of OPC Foundation and how far kind of its genesis and origins, much of it isn't just related to the ability to translate between all the different protocols and all the different vendors that are using these facilities, but also making a standard format for audit and event logging so that if you have a SOC or a SIEM, you have different things to ingest a lot of different disparate pieces of data to unify that. And so the recommendation here is that a unified framework for event logging, which utilizes standard events across devices on the network, should be implemented. The events should be triggered based on specific parameters to avoid a high volume of non-pertinent events being logged. And I can tell you, that's one of the hardest things I think for a business to grapple with. And we just did an engagement a few weeks ago with a company who was trying to figure out kind of the right balance when it came to logging. What do they want to log specifically? What type of visibility were they looking for? Because again, kind of going back to that third bucket of finite resources, you have to determine with whatever resources you have, aka the personnel and their time and hours, what's a reasonable amount of data that they can process, that they can look at? What are the most important types of logging so that you're both being in compliance with whatever regulatory framework that you're responsible for, but that aside, also from a security perspective, what type of events, what type of alarms do you want to be looking for? That way you don't get inundated with a ton of data, because data in of itself is largely useless until you put some context around it, and that's when you start to get that intelligence piece. And the last part of this is that just kind of hammering it home that if you implement a unified reporting framework, this enables OT events to be exported and integrated in some sort of a larger security auditing tool, so that way you can take all those pieces of data, understand what you're seeing, and then apply that, use all the different applications for that data. And then lastly, the fifth and final recommendation that we're presenting today is related to certificate and private key storage. Can't tell you how many times we've seen actors compromise certificates and private keys, and so we're recommending that companies never store private keys or the corresponding certificate files on an unencrypted file system. We recommend using dedicated certificate stores of your operating system and use operating system capabilities for setting the access rights. So for TPM modules or external secured hard drive, like USB-based authentication tokens to store certificates and or private keys, will ultimately improve that security level. So this is something that absolutely critical. Protecting those crown jewels, those certificate and certificate files are something that we've seen actors go after very hard, and it's something that's very important to an adversary that's looking to gain, maintain, and grow their access within your network. And so, in storing those on an encrypted file system and storing those using an operating system capabilities can make a huge difference for an organization looking to protect those. So, kind of to wrap those 5 things up, the 5 things that I spoke about. One was end-to-end encryption, so looking at making sure that you're implementing end-to-end encryption. 2 was certificate authorities and application identities. 3rd was looking at user authentication. 4th was that piece on event logging and auditing, and then lastly, the certificate and private key storage. So taken together, those 5 things are what the FBI is recommending for asset owners and operators, companies, vendors to think about as you're implementing security in your OT environment, whatever that looks like. The key here is looking at your environment and trying to figure out kind of what makes sense for you. I think oftentimes there's a lot of recommendations that are given to industry that are pretty blanket. They're kind of blanket guidance. You really have to make this your own and think through what makes the most sense. But I think our intention here today was to come up with recommendations that I think everyone can benefit from if you implement it at the scale that makes sense for your organization. So the plan moving forward is to put these recommendations in a written form for industry to take a look at. Kind of wrapping up the engagement piece of it. If there's anyone on this call who would like a relationship with the FBI or would like to talk to the FBI, happy to engage. Here in the United States, we have 56 different main offices, and then we're in over 70 countries. So please feel free to engage with me, engage with the FBI. We're looking to engage with industry because ultimately the reason I'm here today and the reason we're all here today is that the issue of security is greater than any single entity, any single country. You know, it really transcends borders. And so trying to secure the OT environment is going to take all of us, and it's an important effort. So I just want to say thank you to OPC Foundation for having me and the Bureau to speak today, and looking forward to engaging with some of you in the future. So I'll yield my time back. Thank you.
Joel, thank you so much, and I can't agree more. So where to start? First of all, thank you for your words. I have a couple of questions, and we know that you're a super busy man. You can't attend the official Q&A later at the end of all the presentations. So I like to ask you 2-3 questions right now while you're online, and hopefully you can stay for that. You mentioned this paper, so we assume it's coming out soon, that we can review the paper and figure out, does OPCUA fit to all that recommendations? Is this correct, what I understood?
Yes, so we're currently in the drafting phase. We have a draft put together. This is, I think the cool thing here is that this is really it's not a threat-based paper as much as it's really taking a look at these recommendations that, as I kind of mentioned, I think all 5 of these are very doable for folks across the board. So I can't give you a definitive date because you know how the government works. You know, things always go a little bit slower than we might like. But we're aiming to get this out in the next few months, if possible, to start that conversation with OPC and as well as your members, and also some of your working groups that I know are doing some really incredible work, especially on each of these 5 things I know are touched on in a number of your working groups.
Perfect, and obviously we love to cooperate, continue the cooperation which has been initiated here with Mike Clark, our Director in North America. One more question, you mentioned that obviously even FBI is obviously a North America organization taking care on security. At the end, we are in an international world. Machine builders from United States are selling machines to run somewhere in the world, and also some European, German, Italian, France, whatever machine builders are sending and selling machines over running in US. So we are in this international world. Wouldn't it make sense that also these cybersecurity departments would work more together? Are you in contact on these manufacturing topics with other colleagues of you in other agencies, for example, in Europe?
Yes, in fact, we work really closely with international partners. And when I say partner, that term includes not just your traditional government, from government to government, but conversations with multinational corporations that may have a headquarters in Germany, for example, and subsidiaries here in the United States, or vice versa. To your point, when it comes to traditional norms of law enforcement, a lot of the rules don't apply. That's really the cyber jurisdictions is a tricky thing, which is why we have presence in over 70 countries. We have specific cyber legal attaches, which work directly with the host country's law enforcement. So that way, for example, if we may see targeting here, overseas that may have no nexus to the United States, but we're going to pass that information to the victim company, which may not be an American company or may not be on U.S. soil. So working closely, as I mentioned, to protect critical infrastructure around the world, because our interest is ultimately in being in that defensive role of providing kind of the best practices. We've been doing cybersecurity advisories and other notices along with our partners at CISA here in the United States. And I can't think of a specific one off the top of my head, but there's been a few recently on some of the ransomware groups that have been jointly produced and written with maybe 5, 6, 7 other countries in Europe and overseas. So definitely it takes, they say it takes a village. In this case, it takes the whole world. So working really closely across those traditional boundaries to share information.
Okay, and maybe you allow one last question. So we know that well, I never mentioned and I never said live and in any conversation that if you include OPC into your device, the device is secure. And also you talked about there's a long list of secure boot, where to store certificates. You mentioned that explicitly. And so on and so on. So but we know and do our best, not only integrated security by design, but also have a continuous monitoring team under Randy Armstrong, and I know you are in contact with him, running weekly meetings, be reactive if we get reports or proactive. The question I have is, there are other regions and governments where they do, on the one hand, recommendation papers, what you do, but also where they analyze specific technology which is designed and which is used in critical infrastructure, like OPC. For example, the German BSI, because of the relevance of OPC for the German Industry 4.0 initiative, have meanwhile analyzed OPC twice. First time they started 2014, published in 2016, and also in 2020 they made an analysis on both the specification and some implementation reference code. Is the FBI doing or planning similar topics? Are you planning to review technology which you feel it is popular in specific areas, or is this out of your scope?
So it's mostly that's mostly out of our scope. However, we work closely on with a number of agencies that do a lot of that work. CISA, the Department of Energy, Department of Transportation, and some others here, at least in the United States. But also, kind of as I mentioned, where we do working groups overseas. We're working closely with some of the open source entities that do similar work, kind of the nonprofit work on the open source software side of things. There's a lot of OSS and OT, so looking at those issues as well. So we're definitely one of the people who come to the table and have equity there, but we're not necessarily the primary driver. But what we try to do and what we try to bring to that conversation is an idea of where the threat is at and what that looks like. So especially more recently, you've seen a lot of cyber criminal groups that are getting more active in OT. That's something that we've been monitoring closely and developing recommendations for, so that asset owners and operators understand, hey, what that risk profile looks like. So definitely something that we're keen to do, especially when, it's something you said resonated with me, which is, whether it's with OPC UA and some of the others that provide kind of a similar function in terms of being a standard organization. Malicious actors are always looking to abuse legitimate functions within software and within hardware. So in many cases, I think one of the biggest challenges the industry faces today is that if a malicious adversary comes into possession of legitimate credentials, for example, and logs in and is using a legitimate function, there's no pass for that. There's no mitigation besides preventing that adversary from gaining that legitimate access. So that's something we've been focusing on, is really telling companies to harden the ability so you don't have actors that are using legitimate functions within software and hardware, because that's really difficult to defend against. If it's legitimate function, it's not malicious in and of itself. So that's really where a lot of our focus has been, and why we look forward to working with OPC Foundation, moving forward to understand where the industry is going, the standards that you're setting, which affect nearly every industry, and hopefully contributing something to that conversation. So always a big fan of feedback. If we're not, providing the right type of inputs, let us know if we can collaborate on that, because it's something that we're definitely interested in doing.
Joel, absolutely. I have 10, 20, 100 more questions, but this would definitely be complete out of scope and running out of scope on your thoughts on the European Resilient Cyber Act and so on and so on. But let's put that offline. We like to cooperate with you, continue the cooperation, and your guest always welcome on our next events next year.